The Great Lakes are some of the world's most fascinating bodies of water, being five huge freshwater lakes in close proximity where there isn't really anything that's comparable anywhere else. In particular, Lake Superior is the second largest lake in the world, with the other four not far behind. But how exactly did these behemoths form? How are they related, and how do they affect the environment around them? Before we get into all that, I'd appreciate if you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. Okay, so to start, how did these gigantic freshwater lakes come into existence? Well, as with many things in this part of North America, they originate all the way back at the end of the last ice age. Approximately 15,000 years ago, what is now the American Midwest and Canadian Shield was buried underneath an enormous ice sheet that was a mile thick in some places. As the climate began to warm, the ice began to recede back to the north, but all of that melted water had to go somewhere. The enormous weight of the glaciers had drastically compressed the land beneath them, and as the ice began to melt, the water had nowhere to go except the depressions that had formed between the edges of the glacier's advance, where land didn't get compressed as much, and the edge of the ice sheet itself. This process has happened all over northern North America over the past few thousand years, creating the thousands of small lakes and ponds that dot northern and eastern Canada's forests to this day. What sets the Great Lakes apart, however, is that they formed into depressions left by ancient tectonic rifts from hundreds of millions of years ago, which allowed the water to cool substantially deeper and over a much larger area than they likely would have otherwise. Since the surrounding topography was still compressed from the glacier that had just receded, there was a point where the likes of Lakes Michigan, Superior, and Huron were all connected in one ginormous lake. Similarly, it allowed for this lake to have three separate outlets to the ocean, those being the Mississippi River Valley to the southwest, the Hudson River Valley to the southeast, and the St. Lawrence River Valley to the northeast. As time went on, however, the land around the lakes began to rebound, separating the gigantic proto-lake into its modern-day counterparts and closing off the Mississippi and Hudson River outlets, leaving the St. Lawrence River Valley as the only way for water from the lakes to drain into the ocean. Okay, so now that we know how the Great Lakes formed, how exactly are they related to each other? Well, the five lakes are all connected, with various rivers linking the lakes to each other as well as to the ocean. At the top of the lake chain, you have Lake Superior, which is by far the largest and deepest of all the lakes, being so massive that it alone constitutes a full 10% of the world's freshwater supply. It is fed by over 200 rivers and lakes surrounding it, but it only has one major outlet, that being the St. Mary's River to the southeast. This modestly sized river flows for about 75 miles or 120 kilometers before emptying into Lake Huron, the second largest of the individual lakes. Lake Huron extends to the southeast for 200 miles before it reaches its outlet, that being in the St. Clair River at its southern tip. This river flows into Lake St. Clair, a smaller freshwater lake formed by much of the same processes described above, and then flows past downtown Detroit before emptying into Lake Erie. Unlike Lake Superior and Huron, which are all fairly remote and detached from civilization, Lake Erie is home to a number of major cities, with Toledo and Cleveland in Ohio, Erie in Pennsylvania, and Buffalo in New York all located along the lake's roughly 250-mile or 390-kilometer length. At its eastern end, Lake Erie has its outlet in the Niagara River. Up until this point, the difference in surface elevation between lakes has been relatively modest, with only 30 feet or 10 meters separating Lake Erie's 570 feet from Lake Superior's 600 feet above sea level. However, this is about to change drastically as the Niagara River is about to flow over the glacially formed Niagara Escarpment, forming the awe-inspiring natural wonder that is Niagara Falls. North of the falls, the river finally empties into Lake Ontario, which is the smallest of the Great Lakes and has a surface elevation of only 240 feet above sea level, a 330 feet or 100-meter drop from that of Lake Erie. After about another 200 miles, Lake Ontario flows into the St. Lawrence River, which flows through major cities such as Montreal and Quebec City before finally emptying out into the Atlantic Ocean via the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Now, the more astute of you may have noticed something interesting. What happened to Lake Michigan, the only one of the Great Lakes to be contained entirely within U.S. borders? Well, it turns out if you look really closely, Lake Michigan and Lake Huron are actually still the same lake. The two lakes are connected at their northern endpoints at the Straits of Mackinac, which separates Michigan's lower peninsula from its upper peninsula. At 5 miles or 8 kilometers wide, the flow of water between the two lakes is substantially larger and more bidirectional than the small rivers connecting the other lakes, which keeps them at the same surface elevation, and thus makes them the same lake when viewed from a hydrological standpoint. As a result, the two lakes, when put together, have an area that is about 50% larger than that of Lake Superior. But since Lake Superior is on average much deeper than either Michigan or Huron, it still holds more water overall. Alright, enough talking about how water moves between the lakes. What, if any, impact do these giant bodies of water have on the surrounding environment? Well, if you were to stand on the shore of one of these lakes without knowing what they were, you would probably assume that you were standing by the ocean, since the water stretches out as far as the eye can see. How is that important? Well, in terms of how the Great Lakes influence their surroundings, that assumption isn't entirely wrong. The lakes are big enough to significantly moderate the climate around them, with coastal areas experiencing cooler summers and milder winters than regions further inland, though their locations in the upper mid latitudes means these areas still experience cold winters and mild summers regardless. This moderating climate actually allows for wineries and other fruit farms to flourish on the shores of some lakes, as the climate allows for these crops to grow significantly further north than they would be able to otherwise. One interesting thing to note is that due to their extreme size, the Great Lakes rarely completely freeze over, only really coming close during the coldest of cold snaps. This can result in an interesting situation where typically during the late fall and early winter, there can be periods where there is extremely cold air moving above unfrozen lake water. When this happens, moisture rises from the lakes and gets caught up in the cold air mass above. Westerly winds then blow the moisture onto the eastern shores of the lakes, depositing all this accumulated moisture in the form of snow. When conditions are perfect, some truly monstrous so-called lake effect snowstorms can occur, with one notable example in December of 2022 dumping over 6 feet or 2 meters of snow in parts of western New York. Since the prevailing winds tend to be out of the west, lake effect snow happens frequently in cities like Cleveland, Buffalo, and Syracuse, but they hardly ever happen in places like Chicago, Detroit, or Toronto, since the wind comes from onshore instead of offshore. In general, the large amount of moisture the Great Lakes hold tends to amplify storm systems as they move from west to east, and severe thunderstorms and even some tornadoes aren't uncommon in the region. Overall, the Great Lakes are a volatile system, and the presence of gigantic lakes deep inside a continent is bound to create weird weather in a place you normally wouldn't find it. And that's all I have to say about the Great Lakes. As always, I'd appreciate if you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. Thanks and have a great day.